Welcome to Quick to Listen. I'm your host, Don Mirma. Today, I'm here wholeheartedly with Raymond Lynch, a composer, guitarist, lutenist, and philosopher of mathematics. As a child, Ray studied classical piano. At the age of around 19, he dropped out of college and moved to Spain, where he would apprentice for 3 years under the guitarist Eduardo Sáenz de la Maza. He then lived in New York City, where he toured for years as the lute player in the Renaissance Quartet. Ray's music then underwent what to me is a remarkable transformation, which I hope we'll talk about, as he dove into electronic music, developing the gorgeous crystalline palette that he would use on his solo records, The Sky of Mind, Deep Breakfast, No Blue Thing, and Nothing Above My Shoulders But the Evening. 1984's Deep Breakfast was a phenomenon. Without performing live, Ray Lynch sold 50,000 copies of the record out of his and his wife's apartment before signing a distribution deal. After the distribution deal, it went on to sell 1.4 million copies. Ray Lynch is considered a father of the New Age genre, but personally, I don't enjoy New Age, and I love your compositions. He's the real deal. The music is highly contrapuntal, charged with an understated momentum, masterful in its use of space. When I think of New Age, I think of washes of synth with bird sound effects overdubs, something you hear at a massage parlor, something that's designed to calm you down. Ray Lynch's music isn't designed to calm you down. It has an ecstatic quality. Rather than New Age, I think of it as transcendental realism, a term I've borrowed from Adi Da Samraj, a spiritual teacher under whom Ray studied. This is music that realistically portrays a transcendental mind state. For the past 15 years or so, Ray Lynch has been writing a book on ancient civilizations and sacred mathematics. I've been able to read the first chapter, and I think it's brilliant. Ray Lynch, welcome. Thank you for coming. It's an honor to have you.
It's my pleasure.
You live in Middleton, California with your wife, Kathleen.
Yeah, I live in Lake County. It's about an hour and a half north of San Francisco.
Can you help me visualize where you're calling from right now?
Well, I'm sitting in my studio, which is in a rural area. It's right next to a sanctuary that was established by Adi Da. And I've been up here for about 18 or 19 years. And before that, I lived in Marin and in San Francisco itself.
What effect does...
I live, the studio is about 100 yards away from the main house, and so I have a lot of privacy here. And particularly over the last 15 years or so that you mentioned, when I've been working on this book project that I'm presently working on, I've essentially been a kind of a hermit, although I'm not trying to isolate myself altogether at all, but I do have a lot of work to do, and I have to concentrate, and I enjoy not being interrupted. So I can have my own kind of schedule and work in peace, basically.
Do you have any rituals or practices? I mean, meditation, diet, avoiding certain media?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's not a single answer. For years, I was living a very kind of disciplined life of a student with strict dietary obligations and meditational practices and routines and a very ordinary schedule, and also was doing my work. That has changed since I've basically become a hermit, and my spiritual practice is not the same anymore, although, I still am careful about my diet and meditation and so forth. But it's not something that's established by rules. It's something established by just the way I am at this point. In other words, meditation to me, it doesn't mean something that starts at a certain time and place and goes on for an hour and then you go off and do something else. The spiritual practice is continuous. It goes on all the time.
So for you, in such a rural setting, there must be a meditative quality to simply walking?
Well, that depends. If I fall down, it's not. But it's just that it's like everything else. I'm attending in the way I always do. I'm aware of my spiritual master, essentially. And I'm not particularly concerned about what I always used to be thinking about when I was doing something like walking around or doing anything really, working even. So the point is that in the process of doing this project, for complex reasons that I'm not fully certain of, I can't specify them, but the project changed me. And I realized that I was a true devotee rather than simply a student of Adi Da's. And that was a revelation. It made a lot of difference in my life.
Even your fans may not know about a record you released in 1982 called Truth is the Only Profound. Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, that's a unique effort on my part because it combines prose with music, accompaniment.
How can I be loved if the hair does not stand on end when there is contemplation of me? How can I be loved if the heart does not melt in my presence? How can I be loved if tears of joy do not pass freely from the eyes when I am standing there?
And I took certain texts that I thought were particularly relevant and powerful from the written work of my teacher and put a music background or accompaniment to it. And I had never actually tried to do that before. And it was an interesting process because it's not so easy to do. But I liked the result, and so did my teacher, so I was very pleased by that.
Compositionally, how did you develop the pairings?
Well, that was the whole discipline for me in that project. It was finding the right kind of music and how to use it and the timing. It was very, very complex in a way, although the result is very simple. But the music that I used was music that I had written mostly, with a few exceptions. And I simply picked out pieces, after basically a trial and error process. To find out what worked, and then I would get the timing down right, and I would do editing with some of the narratives that I recorded.
Okay, I have the CD in the mail. I've heard two of the pieces.
Which ones did you hear? The music of what? No, let's see. What to Remember to Be Happy was one, I think, right?
Yes, the other one was, I think it was called The Essence of Devotion.
Uh-huh. Okay. And what did you think?
I actually find, so I should let people know, I have watched several videos by Adi Da, and I've read part of one of his books. I think it's a really cool genre. I'm a little bit of an overanalyzer with music, so I find myself like listening to the music and ignoring the vocals, or vice versa.
Right.
I don't listen to opera either.
Actually, I do the same thing. I have the same characteristic. When I listen to songs, for example, popular songs, I almost always get absorbed in the music, and I don't follow the words.
I am dying to know what music you listen to.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I've listened to a lot of different kinds of music.
Let's just say, like in the past week.
Well, the simplest answer to that is that it might sound odd to some people, but I basically listen to my own music.
That doesn't sound odd to me. I do that.
Even though I have a huge collection of CDs of all kinds of music, a lot of classical music in particular, but also some more popular stuff and some ethnic stuff and some popular stuff. When I was a teenager, I was a fan of rock and roll for a while and jazz, although that wasn't my main interest, but I was interested in it and did perform, in an amateur way.
As a guitarist?
Yeah, I played guitar, and I did some singing as well. But I'm not a singer, particularly. However, when I went to New York and was doing early music, I wouldn't sing in, professional performances so much, but my colleagues and I had a summer school for early music, and we would all sing in that. And that was when I learned how to sing in the sense of singing without restraint, where I could sing full out and over basically a tenor range. And obviously not a trained voice, but, I could stay in tune and I could certainly be heard. And that was a revelation for me because I didn't even know that I could do that.
Yet your music is generally, really with the exception of Truth is the Only Profound, wordless.
Right. I do instrumental music professionally. But before I did instrumental music, I did devotional music for the community that I live in. And my teacher actually asked me when I, not too long after I joined the community, if I could develop some chants for us to use. And I had never done that or even considered doing it. And I thought it would be pretty easy to do because, chants are very simple, they're repetitive, they're often call and response kind of things. And they don't involve any kind of complexity or development. And so I thought it would be a pretty simple thing to do. I found that it was not all that easy to do because they had to have the right kind of feeling, and I had to be in the right kind of feeling and a responsive mood and awareness to write the music so that it would be effective. I did that for more than a decade, and I was singing. I was the chant leader, and I played the guitar generally in accompaniment. And I learned a great deal by doing that. And I did find out that it wasn't all that easy.
I imagine that boiling down, after having been such a prolific student, that boiling it down to chant must have made you very aware of the fundamental effects of certain intervals or certain timing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. Those kind of things became very important.
I'm guessing that you don't have a personal codified impression of certain intervals, though. There's an alchemy to it. But maybe you do. If you do, feel free to share.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, by the alchemy. What are you referring to?
Well, by alchemy, I mean figuratively, not the fact that we do know that there are certain intervals that have certain effects.
Right.
like in tiny geometries, there's during the swelling rising sections, a trumpet-like instrument does a 1/5, which is like a traditionally kind of triumphant clarion call effect.
Right.
But generally, things that intervals and effects that have such an unambiguous kind of identity are the exception, I would say. Usually,
Right.
it's much more of an alchemy that composers have to kind of muddle around in and just figure it out.
Right. Well, my experience with that is that, well, first of all, I don't think about music in a technical sense, especially when I'm writing it. I write intuitively, and I write from my feeling, and let the alchemy, and it really is a kind of an alchemy, I'll let that take care of itself.
4 out of the 6 pieces on The Sky of Mind begin with a bell ringing and reverberating for a while.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely a distinct choice. Why?
Right. Well, that's an interesting point that you bring up, because Sky of Mind in its present form is not the way it was originally released. Originally, there were no breaks in the music. It was 40 or 50 minutes without a break, and the bells, Tibetan bells, you could call them, were in between every piece, and there was a fade into the music. And there was a specific reason for doing that, although I might not have been able to quite define it at the time. But it was like I wanted to have a sense of an unorganized, spontaneous void, sort of, which I could represent musically. Has to be something there that was completely improvised. It didn't have an order. It was just a context, a bed. And then the music would rise out of that as a different kind of thing, an organized, harmonious, written as received music. And that would happen with all of the 6 pieces. The reason I changed it is because I was getting some airplay, and everybody who plays music on radio, for example, they have to have cuts. They have to have a beginning and an ending. And my pieces were hard to, line up so that you would just get that. And so the record company that I was involved with at the time suggested that I make it easier to play in that way. And so I reorganized the album so that there were definite cuts. I often left the bells in to some extent at the beginning and the end, but not nearly as much. So it was it's a different kind of feel in a way now.
You would probably agree. I do sometimes say that all music is improvised. People forget that. For every aspect of even the most thoroughly constructed piece, it did come out of the void initially.
There's some truth to that, I think, and for me, I can say that I certainly don't improvise the performances that you hear on the records. That's very elaborately planned and recorded systematically and so on and so forth. But the genesis of that music comes from stuff that just happens. I will characteristically, when I'm composing or thinking about doing some kind of piece, I just play around on guitar or more often the piano and see what happens. And on occasion, I come across a particular melody or a rhythmic theme or some kind of harmonic progression that strikes me as beautiful. And then I will work with that. And then later combine that with other similar pieces or things that I really like that seem compatible and make a piece out of that. So it began with improvisation. And in another sense, it's neither composed nor improvised. It's given. It's a matter of receiving. Once a piece is more or less felt or designed and more or less in place, but it's not developed at all, it has to express itself. It tells me what it needs to be. And I found that the main job and function of a composer is not so much this overt creativity, but the capacity to be receptive and sensitive to what the music actually is trying to tell me that it needs to be. And if I listen to that and develop the piece accordingly, then I can have a sense of when it's right. In other words, it has a way that it needs to be finalized so that it actually is an expression of what it should be. And that's when I can let go of it. And until that time, I cannot. I have to work on it until it's right. Sometimes that's very easy, very quickly forthcoming. Celestial Soda Pop was very easy for me to write. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. A piece like Ivory, for example, it just drove me nuts. I just couldn't seem to get it right, and it took about 6 months for me to get it right. But then when it was right, it didn't sound like it was difficult. It just sounded the way it should sound. It was what it was supposed to be, and that's when I knew it was done.
I think people want to know, are you sitting on a treasure trove of unreleased music?
Well, I certainly have a lot of failed attempts sitting around, but I would not use them at this point if and when I start writing again. It's possible that could happen, but basically with each piece I start afresh. It's not like I go looking through catalogs of stuff that I've done in the past.
Wow, that's interesting. So it's kind of a completely... I assume you don't ultimately track list them in the same linear order in which they were composed. Do you?
No.
Let's talk about your piece, Tiny Geometries. I want to take you through my experience of listening to it.
Okay.
And this sort of, in this, of course, wordless way, I think it achieves a sort of, it teaches a lesson. That's what I hear. It begins with random or seemingly random arpeggios. Slowly, order emerges. It grows into an almost unbearably ecstatic thing. That's where those 1/5 fanfare sounds are woven in. It recedes, it swells, it recedes again, leaving the listener with the same, quote, random background noise of arpeggios that it began with. But I hear at the end that randomness differently. At the beginning of a song, I'm just automatically listening for patterns, and things sound wrong to me if the patterns aren't forthcoming. But by the end of Tiny Geometries, I find myself accepting of those notes as they happen. I'm not clinging to the triumphant peaks of the song. I'm in the moment, and I think it's remarkable that through the techniques of Western composition, you conveyed that. How much of that was intentional?
Well, the piece was intentional enough, but it was put together. I mean, the sounds at the beginning and at the end were made with an ARP Odyssey, an early mono synthesizer. And I was doing a sample and hold patch and just manually improvising, basically, with various sliders that modulate certain parts of the sound.
That's where you're holding down different keys and then the arpeggio cycling through those keys?
Well, I wasn't even holding down keys. They were just playing. I mean,
okay.
It was a sample and hold kind of thing. And the trick was to get it to move into a pattern and a tonality that was commensurate with what I was going to bring in later, the actual arpeggios played on another synthesizer that were more ordered and musical, you could say. And when I mixed it, I had to do it manually. I didn't have, the kind of software and stuff. This was done, it was analog, and it was done with me doing things manually. So I had to get it right, and it just worked out at some point, and that was what I left as the recording.
Thank you. That's really interesting. All right, I'm going to read to you an Adi Da quote. It's probably not the most representative one, but here it is. Clearly, the industrial societies of the future must overcome the confusion of social and sexual ideals that we have inherited from the ancient Eastern-Western division of the world, or the like division between the functions of brain and body. The outer-directed social enterprises must be permitted to be intelligent, life-positive, and therefore sex-positive. Would you say that your music is sex-positive? Because I'm thinking of the O of pleasure, your feeling shoulders, and just the general warmth of a lot of it.
Well, the most basic answer is, how could I be sex negative? If it wasn't for sex, I wouldn't be talking to you. I was born because of sex.
The true spirit of mom and dad.
Right. I'm the product of mom and dad, as everybody else is. So sex negative is just, it doesn't make any sense. What I think my teacher was addressing is the kind of the perversion or the misunderstanding of sex, both in a positive way and in a negative way. There's no reason why spirituality should be pro-sex or anti-sex. It's just part of being a human. It's not an issue, except that it's often abused and used for, the wrong reasons, you might say. But it can be a spiritual practice or part of one. Tantra in the East is an example of that. So there's no reason, in other words, in a true spiritual practice to avoid an ordinary human life. And Adi Da wouldn't recommend that except in certain cases where there's a tendency for that to happen anyway. So the students of Adi Da are basically very ordinary people in the sense that they live in the world, have jobs, have raised families, and do everything that other people do. But it's all a part of their spiritual practice. It's not like you compartmentalize a spiritual practice and confine it to the meditation hall. It fills your life. It's a total commitment in that sense. So it's sex positive in the sense that sex is simply a necessary and human activity for the human species, for example.
Adi Da is quite a scholastically thorough man from what I've read. He studied at a Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, at a Russian Orthodox Seminary in New York. He was a Siddha Yoga follower. He studied at under Swami Muktananda's ashram in India. Mm-hmm. And of course, so I've only encountered him, who has obviously had a profound effect on your life, your day-to-day life. I've only encountered him mediated through, media devices, through YouTube and some books. What are the lessons or the practices that he has given you that have helped you take his lessons into your day-to-day life?
Well, I could spend hours talking about that. He certainly made a profound difference, and he relieved me of my presuppositions about what a spiritual life is supposed to be, and simplified it greatly, and also addressed the particular kind of issues that I had in my own life. When I came, I didn't know this, but I realized later that I wasn't any good at giving or receiving. Most people are good at one of the other, at least. And he taught me, in particular, in my personal relationship with him, everything that he demonstrated to me and illustrated for me was all about giving and receiving. And the reason for that is that a true spiritual practice is very simple, really. It's open-heartedness. And I knew that was involved because he calls his teaching the way of the heart. But, Jesus does too, was another spiritual master. He was a master of the heart. Well, Adi Da was teaching the way of the heart. And open-heartedness is all about giving and receiving. And what I finally realized is that they couldn't be separated. They really are the same thing. In other words, to give open-heartedly is to receive love. Give love, you receive love. And you don't hold on to it. It's not a possession. It's a reality, and it has to do with human relationships. And open-heartedness is both. its reception of truth, reality, beauty, love, and the giving of it back immediately. You don't own it. In the same way that I don't really own my music. It was given. And I receive it. And I give it back. And that's what I hope the recordings that I've made can do. I mean, that's the ultimate point of really doing it, although I didn't understand that all the time when I was doing it. But that's really what it is and should be.
Let's talk about your book. I'm not a mathematician, but I do sometimes read about it, and I have a decent aptitude. Like I went to business school. I dropped out, but I was on the honor roll and whatever. I taught the SAT. This subject of the chapter so it seems like the real deal, as far as I can tell. The way in which you talk about math. The subject of the chapter you sent me is infinity. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is maybe a good quote to get us into it. Aristotle's potential infinity marks the beginning of incoherence in Western mathematics. Following Aristotle's lead, Georg Cantor pushed mathematical coherence over a cliff. We are all playing around in the wreckage. You write about how the infinite or the void or the prior has been impeded by mathematicians' dodgy importation of, quote, infinity into their models. For example, Cantor's acceptance of infinite sets of infinity in set theory.
Right. Well, there's a long answer to all of that. Let me start by saying that when I originally started this book, I intended it for it to be about the relationship between mathematics and music, which is a very interesting subject. There have been a number of books written about that because they have a very similar level of abstraction. In some ways they're completely different. In other ways they are very much alike. So that was my intention. But in the course of writing the book, and this is a long story, I realized that I was actually more interested in connecting the dots. So in my study of mathematics, I'm not a trained mathematician, but I've always been interested in math, and I was particularly good when I was young at playing geometry, for example. So I started studying modern mathematics, and I actually have a small library of mathematical books, and it was very fascinating, and I found out that if I applied myself, I could understand it all. But I also found that there was a incoherence at a foundational level in mathematics, and there were arbitrary decrees and definitions of fundamental mathematical things that I objected to. And so I started studying ancient mathematics to see how this had happened, because I wanted to find what the actual original foundations of mathematics were. Well, that's a fascinating kind of thing. But in doing that, I found that I couldn't understand ancient mathematics really without understanding the form in which it was expressed, and it's expressed in cosmology and mythology. And ancient mythology is a can of worms that once you get into it, you realize that it's going to take a while. But I was insisting on connecting the dots, and I kept doing that. And I soon found that my book was not going to be just about mathematics and music. It was going to be about a lot of other things as well. And if you were to ask me now what my book is really about, it still has mathematics and music, tuning theory, and the ancient world, and a few comments about modern mathematics in it. But it's really about human spirituality, and it's about the history of humanity, about modern man. So it goes all the way back to the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, when we became what are called modern humans. And I had to rewrite, essentially, history, because I think that the way we view history now is incorrect in a lot of ways. We've missed something, and we've interpreted it in a particular way that reflects our modern bias. We've projected ourselves upon the past. And I've tried not to do that as much as possible. So I discovered that human spirituality began when we became modern humans. In other words, when about 50,000 years ago in Europe is when there was a group of, like almost an explosion. It looks like that, but it actually happened pretty gradually. But at that time, we acquired a modern language, grammatical language. And we also discovered spirits and could then talk about them. And that has had a profound effect on what we are. And it's not taken into account because modern scholars generally are biased against a spiritual perspective. But it has been an important, perhaps the fundamental driver of who we are from the beginning. And it's only in the last, starting, in my opinion, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, that we've gradually lost that connection to the point now where we have a pretty strong bias against spirituality, and we don't understand ancient spirituality. So my book is, in large part, about correcting that view, because it has dire consequences.
I don't want to go too far into a tangent about something that you may not have read, but I can say that the current best working model that I use for the origin of human society is what I learned from Julian Jaynes in his book, 1970.
Yeah.
Oh, you know that? The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind?
Yeah, it was one of the most interesting books that I read about, 20 years ago or more. I don't completely agree with him, but he was an extremely interesting writer and made some very interesting points. So what was your take on Jaynes? What did you think about it?
I think that it is it seems he has to bring people up on what Jaynes's theory is. Basically, it's that humans did not, more recently than we could possibly believe, like 10,000 years ago, humans were not conscious. They were, and these were humans who were able to build cities. He says that they were obeying the hallucinated voices of gods in a way that is still has echoes in schizophrenia and hypnotic states today. And it's called the bicameral mind theory because he sees evidence for that in the differing functionalities of the two hemispheres of the brain. He's an interesting guy. I know he was the son of a Unitarian minister, and in one way, his book is a sort of dissection of God, because it leaves. I imagine this may be where you depart from it, because it leaves one with this sense of, well, here's a rather thorough and entirely physical explanation for the phenomenon of spontaneous spirituality across the world in early humanity, and it also explains kind of the decline of it. And me having read that, it is kind of my working theory. Like, he's kind of like my Freud. I find it hard to see how it can come back, which I think it is a very mournful sense that gives me.
It's interesting that you bring this up because the work I've been doing recently has to do with the divided brain and the function of the hemispheres, which has a lot to do in supporting the particular historical thesis that I've developed. But the thing about Jaynes is that, it depends upon what you mean by consciousness. But humans have been conscious for far longer than ancient Greece. And he was using that term in a particular way.
Yes, a very narrow way. His term was the analog eye, like the ability to conceptualize oneself on a timeline.
He's talking about a particular kind of subjectivity that has an emphasis on I and the separate ego and so forth, and the sense of I and where it is and what it means. But humans have been conscious in a fundamental sense that is still our way, that began about 50,000 years ago, at least in Europe, but perhaps earlier elsewhere. And I would say that transition happened way back then because humans at that time, Cro-Magnons, for example, became interested in exploring the full spectrum of consciousness. So, and the Aborigines in Australia refer back to in one sense, they refer back to their history as the dream time. And it's all about consciousness.
Are you alluding to psilocybin?
To what?
Like hallucinogenic mushrooms as a
well,
catalyst?
That's a secondary matter, although that is something that I think has been present.
But could you elaborate on what the means were by which they did explore their consciousness?
Incubation, which you could say is a form of meditation. It's a form of stillness. And this is why, for example, caves were so important in the Upper Paleolithic, because that's where you have an environment where you can isolate yourself completely in a environment that is amenable to the body being completely relaxed and undisturbed. And you can lay down or sit in a particular way and just let it go. And presumably the idea, and this is what even meditational practices are about basically, you release all the subjective busyness that typically goes on and just allow what is left to become apparent. And you have to do this in stillness so you won't be interrupted. And in caves, for example, it's temperate. It stays that way. There's nobody there. It's absolutely silent. There's absolutely no light. There's nothing to distract you from the purpose of your exploration. And some shamans, and this is a traditional shamanic technique, would use psychoactive substances, although that wasn't a requirement and it wasn't always done. We have no way of knowing exactly how much of that was involved. But it was an aid and considered one by many ancient shamans, and for that matter, there are some that are still alive that still consider it to be an aid. But it's a secondary matter. The point was to transcend the ordinary state of mind and delusions and complications and attitudes and presumptions about reality, and to allow reality to speak for itself. It's similar to the way I feel about music. You know, a piece of music has to express itself. It will, if you get out of the way, it will reveal what it's trying to be and should be. Well, that was their approach also. If you explore consciousness, you don't do it in a active, intellectual, abstract kind of way. you do it in a way that the experience of it in its fullness can occur. And for that to happen, you have to get yourself out of the way.
To connect this to your art, the cover to your album, Nothing Above My Shoulders But the Evening, is a cave painting. And of course, the name of the album conveys a state of instead of one's mind or head being there, there's the evening itself.
Yeah, that's a phrase of Adi Da's, but the image is a traditional idea expressed as art of headlessness. The head being a symbolic example of mind and intellect and identification and separation, egoic separation. You know, we feel ourselves to be somehow in our heads, that kind of locatedness. And if you let go of that, then there's nothing above your shoulders but the evening. That's what's left. It's like eliminating the objective delusions of separate existence. And when that happens, the void is left. And the void is both an emptiness and a fullness simultaneously. In other words, it's completely paradoxical because it's not something that can be captured by language, for example, so it doesn't make sense to us. But that's the problem that we have, is being sensible in a way that blocks out too much of what is actually present, the obvious, which is neither empty nor full, and yet both simultaneously.
It's important.
And that's called revelation, when it reveals itself. And it's something that comes if you can get out of the way and be headless and allow it to arise.
Here's a quote from Adi Da. The new or emerging culture of man will be religious or spiritual in the highest evolutionary sense, but it will be associated with a rational cosmological understanding. I think it's important for people to see that you are not an irrationalist. Like you are, what I mean is, and I've gotten this both in the chapter you sent me and from what I've read of Adi Da, you accept the worldly realm of rationality, but you want to keep it distinct from the infinite, and you sort of accept that they can paradoxically coexist, or rather exist and not exist.
Well, the way I feel about it is if you're going to have a mind, you might as well have a good one. You know, in a similar way of thinking, if you're going to transcend the ego, you've got to have one to begin with. You know, people can't function in the world without an identity. But that doesn't mean they have to think that that's an ultimate reality. It's a convenience. And it's not really true. In other words, the ego I is a fictitious character. And that's why headlessness, for example, is a symbol of something that's quite other than that. It's about transcendence of egoity, basically. And that's the relinquishment of point of view. The thing about the ego is that it has a location, its locatedness. It's very particular. Now, you know, that's reinforced by everything in our language and in our behavior with each other. So it's not like you're going to eliminate the play of apparent separation, and there's no reason to. It's just to understand what it is, basically, and not take it as seriously as, and certainly not as the ultimate reality. There's something. It's something that needs to be transcended. In other words, if you want to understand even anybody's true situation. And we have a lot of problems because we don't do that. You know, everything reinforces the fact that I'm Ray Lynch. But Ray Lynch is a fictitious character. It's a fiction. It's a fantasy.
Well, I called you Raymond Lynch at the top of the show because that was the name attached to the manuscript that you sent me. And right. Don Mirma isn't my real name. I alter my name a lot, and I've seen that in people. That must be. Is that annoying to be to you to be sort of treated like Ray Lynch all the time?
No, I mean, how else are people going to treat me? You know.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody calls out Ray or Raymond in a room, I turn my head and respond. How could that not be? But the point is to be present in the world as a lover or as a open-heartedness, so that the connection between people at an intuitive level and presumably even a spiritual level is felt. So that's the fundamental context. But there's a play in life, and it has to do with relationships. Ultimately, you could say that relationship is itself an illusion. But that's only true if you're a God-realized spiritual master. Otherwise, it's a kind of a pretense. But it is felt if you're present in the world as an open-hearted giver and receiver of others. It's like when you're listening to music. What I liked about doing live performances was that if the music is really coming out of the performers and they're doing what they can do best, they're giving to the audience, and the audience is moved by it, and they give that energy back to the performer. And this kind of circularity of performer to listener, back to the performer, back to the listener, it can build on itself. And then when that reaches a certain level, a musician on stage, even classical ones that are following the score, can do amazing things that they never thought they could do. There's a kind of a freedom and a security of expression there. And it just keeps reinforcing itself. And my experience after a lot of, actually most of the performances that I gave, is that I was so enlivened and I had so much energy in my body that had been given back to me from the people who were listening, that I couldn't sleep until morning. I would have to walk the streets at night and enjoy, the evening before I could go to sleep, because it was so enriching. And that's what music can be.
Sure. I've found that I usually write a song after I've performed live, and it's almost like a song that it's just a song that felt right for that crowd. That would, it's probably my favorite Bible verse, be quick to listen, slow to speak. That's where the name of the show comes from. I think that a virtuous cycle is created by people listening.
Right.
And that's certainly a sort of a tragic element of culture today, is the emphasis on being heard.
Yeah. It's like the demand for love. It's like feeling that you need to be loved. Now, as a child, you certainly do need to be loved, and mothers are typically very good at that, and the child flourishes because of it. But when you grow up, it's not a matter of demanding love, because that prevents it from happening. It cuts you off from other people. You're saying that I'm separate and I'm by myself, and I really need love, and I really deserve it, and you ought to give it to me. Well, that's absurd. It's ridiculous, and it defeats its purpose. It's a lot better to simply give love and let the rest of it take care of itself. And in my experience, if love is given, it comes back. It's an automaticity. It just happens that way. It feeds itself, just like in a performance. If you're going to have a relationship, in other words, have a good one. Have one that's open. Have one that's free. Have one that is unafraid. Have one in which everybody is giving. And that way, everybody is receiving.
I'm really curious about what you think of high-quality music produced by narcissistic artists, or tortured, spiritually unwell people. I want to read a couple quotes to contextualize this. First is Bernard Chazelle, a professor of computer science at Princeton. He said this about his favorite composer, Bach. Bach did not regard himself as an artist, but as a scientist, a cosmologist of music. Bach's paradigm is quite different from our own. He dedicated each work to the glory of God, not to an audience. He saw himself as discovering patterns in music, not as creating them. Then Dylan Evans has this to say about Beethoven, who is far from his favorite composer. From the speculations of Pythagoras about the music of the spheres in ancient Greece onwards, most Western musicians had agreed that musical beauty was based on a mysterious connection between sound and mathematics, and that this provided music with an objective goal, something that transcended the individual composer's idiosyncrasies and aspired to the universal. Beethoven managed to put an end to this noble tradition by inaugurating a barbaric U-turn away from an other-directed music to an inward-directed, narcissistic focus on the composer himself and his own tortured soul. And then you have Romanticism and then, rock and roll and everything. And I think he pins too much on Beethoven specifically, who has obviously transcendent, late string quartets. But I think he's onto something regarding the overall ethos of Western music.
Yeah, you've raised a point that deserves a very thorough kind of answer, and it's going to be, I have opinions about it, and I don't feel strongly about all of them. I certainly admire Bach. I think most musicians, or at least many musicians, if you were to ask them who they thought was the best composer ever, a lot of them would say Bach. He was extremely gifted. But then so was Beethoven. Beethoven was a master of his medium, but he was a different kind of man than Bach was, as you pointed out. He still produced a lot of great music, some of the best. He's not my favorite composer, but I certainly admire a lot of his music, and I've been moved by it. And he doesn't... You could probably see historically that Beethoven was a pioneer in the kind of expressiveness and approach to the world that has been typical of a lot of artists, a lot of composers ever since, or at least they aspire to it. And there is something narcissistic about it. You could say that the 20th century was the culmination of that. It was like the victory of the ego. And look what it yielded. That century was devastating, with world wars and changes that have been detrimental. And they were paying the consequence for that right now. But it was actually a process that's been going on for a long time. Human egoity has an interesting and, in many ways, unknown, because it has to be, history to it. But it's been around for a long time, but it's gotten increasingly exaggerated. And with Bach, for example, he was serving consciously a sacred purpose. And he felt himself as in a way, a servant, although he knew that he was good. And he was, incidentally, better known in his day as an improviser rather than a composer.
Yes, he was not composing for posterity, which is part of why he made so much.
No, he needed to produce a new cantata every week or every couple of weeks, And he could do that because he wasn't reinventing his language in a way, and Beethoven, in a sense, was. And that's one of the reasons why he had to struggle, why Beethoven had to struggle. Bach inherited a harmonic language that was fully developed, and he didn't try to change it. It worked. It worked for him. He could improvise in that language with a greater facility than anybody else alive at that time, and maybe since that time. So he didn't have to reinvent the language. It's just that he was more fluid and accomplished and comfortable with that than anybody else, by far, I would say. Beethoven had to forge a new kind of thing altogether, and it makes him into a kind of a hero. You know, he was struggling against odds, and he had terrific odds. I mean, a deaf composer, give me a break. You know, how did he do that? Well, he could hear the music. He just couldn't hear the audience when they applauded. He couldn't hear the music that was being made on the stage, but he could hear the music when he was making it because he was completely committed to it. I mean, that was his life. He had nothing else to do. And he felt like it was, it gave a greater spiritual revelation than anything else. He thought he could become wiser by being a musician and or hearing great music than through any other means. And that's not really an unusual sentiment. I mean, a lot of people have felt that way. And Bach may have felt that way too. He wouldn't have said it probably. But he knew that his music served a great purpose, and he was conscious of it being a sacred purpose in particular.
I certainly have more questions. How does a few more sound?
Oh, as many as you want. I could
Okay.
do all afternoon.
Okay. Well, an obvious question an obvious question that came to mind just then is how would you describe the harmonic language of the music you've put out?
Well, I've said before, I think you're aware of this, that my language is not particularly complicated, and like all of the harmonies that I use, and even the counterpoint that I employ, can be found in the Renaissance. And I was very affected by Renaissance music. I played in the Renaissance Quartet in New York City as their lutenist, for example. And I loved Renaissance music, and I especially liked chamber music. When I was a guitarist, I was being trained to be a solo artist, that like a classical pianist today. I was going to walk out on the stage with my guitar without any music and sit down and play an hour or more of music from memory of particular pieces that I had spent years learning how to perform technically. And when I realized that that's what my life was going to be about, I realized that I didn't want that kind of life. It was too stressful. You know, every time you walk out on stage, the thought occurs to you, and even for the some hours before that you're going to forget something and make a fool of yourself and create a very difficult space for everybody in the room. That rarely happens, but it does happen, and I've seen it happen, and it's very uncomfortable. I didn't want to have to deal with that kind of stress all the time, and I didn't want to be playing the same 20 pieces for the rest of my life, you know, as if I was a trapeze artist doing a triple flip or something.
What are the names of a couple of those pieces?
Which ones?
That were comprising your life at the
guitar
time.
Pieces?
Yeah.
Oh, they could be anything, but I liked, Targa and Soar and some Bach transcriptions, a lot of pieces. There's a fairly good repertoire of classical guitar pieces that are well known, but it was very small compared to the amount of chamber music that came out of the Renaissance. And there were two things about it. One, there was more music. I liked it very much, and it was it involved a chamber group, a small group of instruments in which I had, with the quartet, but there were four of us, and that's ideal. Like a string quartet, there's 4 string players in a string quartet. They get to know each other well. They practice all the time. They use music, so they don't have to worry about memory. They get to know each other's musical personality. They respond to it. It becomes a give and take within the group of players itself. And that, to me, was fascinating, and I learned a great deal by doing that. There are certain things you just don't learn if you spend your life, first of all, spending a lot of your time every day in a room practicing by yourself, and then walking that on the stage and playing to an audience by yourself. I learned a great deal from the musicians that I started playing with when I went to New York to play with the Renaissance Quartet, because I was playing with other people. And they were better musicians than I was in a lot of ways. I mean, I could do some things as well as they, but I was the new kid on the block in a way, and they'd been in New York as professionals for many years before that. So they were skilled in that way, and I wasn't. And I had to get that skill very quickly. And the way you get it is by listening. That's one of the ways you learn how to listen to music, at least for me it was. I was listening to the other musicians that I was playing with. And if I didn't do that, I wasn't really contributing to the group. You know, they were all listening to each other and were responding to each other in ways that we couldn't even define, in very subtle ways. But when it really happens, it's the alchemy, as you could say, was extraordinary. And in the case of a lute song, for example, I very much liked the music of Dowland, and I worked with a singer in New York who was an extraordinarily good singer, Gene Hakes, and we did performances in addition to the other work that I was doing. She had a lot of other jobs too, but she was a specialist in early music just as I was. And we worked for years as a duo. I'd play the lute and she would sing lute songs. And after about 2 years of working like that, some truly magical things could happen. And there was a little more flexibility too, because there's a singer and a lutenist, and there weren't other things going on. It's just those two. And I remember a performance that we did once that was all John Dowland, a Renaissance composer, a very famous composer, and very melancholy songs.
That's in the spa, the lost fortunes deplore, light thus much shame disclose.
But things happened in that performance because we were so accustomed to each other and so confident and unafraid that things happened that I was amazed at when I thought about them afterwards. I said, how in the hell did we do that? How could that have happened? You know, it just arose as if it were magic. And the audience could sense that. They knew that. They could feel it.
Like in more objective terms, your rubatos were perfectly synced up.
Well, it wasn't a matter of technical perfection. It was a matter of emotional, affective, and spiritual fullness. And even if we had made mistakes, it wouldn't have mattered, you know. Although that didn't happen in any kind of way that you would notice it, at least. But that would have been even irrelevant. It was the spirit of the thing. It was there. It cohered. It was a whole. It was coherent in a way that an ordinary performance might not be for somebody who was really sensitive to it. There was just a magic to it, and you can't really define it. But it did come with a great deal of work before that. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. But when it does happen, you say, wow, those years of struggle were worth it.
It didn't happen to have been recorded, did it?
No. No, the best stuff is
then we would put it on right now.
The best stuff is never recorded.
Yeah.
But you can capture magical things on a recording as well. It just doesn't happen in the same way. It doesn't have the same. The thing about live performances is that they're live, you know. But as a composer, I was temperamentally more comfortable with working alone and working in my studio and putting pieces together the way everybody else does, basically.
But you undoubtedly carried into the studio that ability, having worked in an ensemble, to listen and treat each part as each voice, because your pieces have an equality to the voices in their prominence.
Mm-hmm. Well, the place where that experience that I've had as a player came into full force is when I was mixing a piece. You know, you record all the parts. Maybe you have 30 tracks of elements that are involved in a complex piece, you know, that you recorded over a period of time, very meticulously, getting everything right. But if you don't get it mixed right, where the volumes are right, the spacing is right, the reverb is right, the EQ is right, it doesn't turn out to be a good piece. So you spend a lot of time on the mix. And on the mix is where your capacity to listen and to actually hear what's there comes into play and is really critical. Even then, when I did mix, I would usually have a professional that I often worked with. He was both an engineer and an amateur kind of musician, but he had golden ears. He really could hear. And we would often mix pieces together, where I would be sitting on, say, the left side of the board, and he would be on the right side of the board right next to me. We'd have our hands on certain faders, you know. They wouldn't all be mixed simultaneously manually. But we didn't use computer-recorded mixes, except in a few places where it was obvious. Otherwise, we wanted the freedom of acting spontaneously and responding to each other while we were mixing. And it might take 100 times to get it where we were satisfied with it. But when we did, it could sometimes be quite remarkable. I would call it a performance. It is a performance. It just didn't have an audience except for us. So we were satisfying ourselves and satisfying the piece. And that's what was important. Because once you release a recording, it's fixed, you know? Mm-hmm. And yet, I can listen to my pieces, as I've said before, I often do, and almost always do. And it's as if I heard them for the first time. I got a fan letter just the other day. Somebody who was talking about that, and they were referring to a particular piece. And it's interesting that the piece they were referring to is called "The Music of What Happens." And he said that when he listened to that piece, he thought it was always the first time that he'd ever listened to it, and he wanted to know why. Well, it's hard to say why, but the reason why is because he was really listening, and the only reason I can think of that he picked out that particular piece, or rather that's the piece that struck him that way, is the character of that particular piece, and it happens to have this title, "The Music of What Happens." That piece happened. It just happened. It wasn't planned. It was accidental. The violin parts, which are a very important part of it, I had recorded against the background of that piece when I was working on it, and just for a completely different reason. I wanted to see if this particular violinist was comfortable enough in a studio situation. I knew he was great live, but I wanted to find out if he could work in the studio with the same kind of excellence that he demonstrated on stage. And he did, but I just happened to record those tracks against this piece because that's what I had up on my board, and I had no intention at all of using it for the piece. But later I was listening to it, and at one point, he did about 6 or 7 takes, and he was improvising. He didn't even want to hear the piece before he started playing against it. So I just kept recording tracks of him improvising against that piece over and over again, about 7 times. And later, a week later, I guess it was, I wanted to go back to that piece, and I wanted to listen to it. And I had left 5 of his faders up, I think. And I was almost shocked because I heard all this violin stuff coming out over this piece, and I thought, oh Jesus, I got to turn that off. And I listened a little more, and I said, there's something about that. And so I started exploring that, and I started taking out parts, putting in parts, moving things around just a little bit, using the violin. And after a while, I couldn't take it out. I mean, that was part of the piece. It was integral to the piece. And it was the piece speaking to me. It happened accidentally. And yet it worked. It was what the piece needed. And it took me a little while to realize it. But it's an incredibly complex piece in a way. Sometimes he's playing as many as 5 different tracks at the same time. And I would call it my edge of chaos piece, because it has as many elements in it as anybody, even a professional, could hear at one time. Something new would jump out each time he heard it. And this is my experience with all of my pieces, even the simple ones. I hear things that I've never heard before.
Oh, I was going to say that's with that piece, which is one of your most recent pieces, released with the greatest hits.
Yeah.
That's a new letting another person into the randomness seems new to your process. But you're saying that every single piece has an element of that in a way.
Well, it does to me. I mean, that's why I still enjoy listening to my music. Because in a sense, I've never heard it before. Each time I hear it anew. It's not the same. And so I can hear it. And this is the way aside from that, the way I feel about music, if it's great music, it doesn't matter how old it is. I mean, I listen to a lot of Renaissance music, or at least I used to. But that was written 500 years ago. As far as I'm concerned, it should still be popular. But in the music business, the emphasis is always on having something new. That's the way they generate more and more sales. And, that's a understandable motive in this world. They're doing it to make money. But go ahead.
I think your music sounds timeless. I don't think it sounds old at all. It's like you got in as electronic music. As I know there are a number of overdubs, but the textural palette is predominantly electronic. It kind of exists in this abstracted space, and so it does it by default. It lacks these signifiers that one can use to pick up. This has the warm hiss of a microphone that dates it to the early 60s, et cetera, et cetera. The miking techniques. Oh, this is a doo-wop group, and they're all using one microphone. One becomes just really adept at picking out things like that. And then compositionally, there are things that identify a piece as being from a certain time, like certain trill patterns. Your music seems to lack those signifiers. Is that intentional?
No. I just make the music the way I can and the way I feel it ought to be. But the main point about the music that I want to make is that if it's great music once, it's always great music. And it can be all different kinds. I mean, there could be great popular music. And there's no reason why people should stop listening to them. You know? I mean, I feel, or have gotten a lot of requests or queries about when my next album is going to come out. Although not so much anymore because people have realized that I must be doing something else. But I felt a certain pressure about that, to keep putting out music, because that's the pattern that a successful artist would generally follow. But I don't feel the pressure about that. And as far as I'm concerned, the pieces that I've already done satisfy me. I mean, it's not like I have to hear a new piece when the old pieces always sound new anyway. And I think that's the way it is with any good music, no matter when it was written or how many times you've heard it. If it's great music, you can always stand to read it again or to hear it again, you know.
That is interesting you said read. Do you ever sit and read music?
Yeah, I've done that, although I'm not an expert at it. There are a few people around. Beethoven would be an example, and certainly Bach, who could look at a complex score. I have a friend that can do this. Look at a complex score and follow it and pretty much know how it sounds. You know, they're just technically that good. I can only do that to a limited extent, and it's not important to me that I be able to do that, because all the music I love is recorded anyway, or else I can hear it, live at a performance, which is a different kind of experience than listening to a recording. But the point is, there's a lot of good music, and it's going to remain good. It's going to be good. Just like in literature or art, paintings by a master. Well, you don't look at it once. You could go back and look at it 200 times, but you're not going to see it the same way. And what's the point of owning it if you can't keep looking at it?
Well, you have made undeniably at least one masterpiece, I would say. And
one?
Well, I hate to be one of those people. I'm somebody who was introduced to you through Deep Breakfast, and I have more of a sentimental attachment to that.
Yeah,
still,
a lot of people do. It's true.
But preparing for our conversation today has really blown your oeuvre wide open for me, and I've really been enjoying it.
Right. I understand why people like Deep Breakfast. First of all, a lot of people have heard it. Second of all, I think it's easy to like, and I love it. But I could say, for example, that Nothing Above My Shoulders, but the evening is a more accomplished album from my perspective. And it's an album that I made where I was not concerned at all with how it would be received. And you may have noticed that it has what you might call a heavier classical influence and bias than most of my albums.
Yes, the most live instruments, easily.
Well, I used a lot of acoustic instruments that were played by, really good players from the San Francisco Orchestra. But I wrote, I didn't try to avoid more complex classical kind of pieces. And I really enjoyed having the freedom to do that, because it didn't matter. It never occurred to me to wonder how other people would respond to it. I simply figured that if it worked for me, if it was beautiful for me, then other people would find it that way as well. Maybe not as many as responded to Deep Breakfast, but that just wasn't an issue for me when I was making that album. And I love that album.
Beethoven was asked why people had responded better to his 7th symphony than to his 8th, and he said, without a moment's hesitation, because the 8th is so much better.
Well, I'm not exactly saying that, but I know what he means.
And the 8th is more nuanced and emotionally subtle and less dramatic and overwhelming than the 7th.
Yeah, well, he may have said that because it was his most recent piece, and that was the music that he loved the most at the time. Who knows? He didn't write any bad symphonies, let's put it that way.
Yeah. I have a question about the concept of permanence.
Permanence?
Yeah. Really not talking about music anymore. But you said in the chapter that you sent me, The Void, that the great heroes in humanity's history have permanently realized their prior condition.
Yeah.
I am of a Taoist leaning, and as I sort of intuitively see it, nothing, not even enlightenment, can be permanent.
Yeah.
Why permanence? What
well,
is permanence?
You're touching on a really interesting point that it's a presumption that is ubiquitous in our culture at this point, and it's even hard for anybody to disagree with it. You see it in scholars a lot. It's the idea that certainty and permanence are the assertion of those things is arrogant and impossible, because everything is in flux and there is no real certainty. And at the level at which they're considering it, that's true. At the level of the mind, at the level of phenomena, at the level of appearance, at the level of modern philosophy and science and all of that stuff, everything is in flux. And you find it in ancient philosophy as well. But I happen to have a spiritual master who is a 7th stage avatar. And he speaks of, you can't even call it a state, but it's a realization. And the best way to understand it is that it was a revelation of reality itself. And if you remember in The Void, I began that essay with attempting to describe the void. And I said that it has no characteristics other than lack of. And it doesn't change. It is infinite. It's eternal. It is reality itself. It is motionless. It's not a modification. It's the context of all arising. In other words, it's consciousness itself. Now, the mind cannot grasp that. The full God realization, the divine understood as reality itself, that doesn't change. The divine doesn't change. However, the divine persists. It's always available. The truth is always available. How could reality itself not be always available? Well, if you look at it from the perspective of the mind and from conditional existence, you can say, well, if it exists over time, it must change, because that's what time is all about. It is joined at the hip with change and process. But infinity is not a process. Eternity has nothing to do with time, and yet it is always already the case. It doesn't go away. And in that sense, it does not change, but it is always available. Love itself doesn't change, but it's always available. It's always being enacted. So it appears to be that there is no certainty and there is no permanence. And that's true enough to be said when it's in the context of what most people are talking about. But when you're talking about reality itself, it is not the case. Consciousness itself doesn't change. But every example of conscious thought is nothing but change. The mind exists entirely in time. So the mind is changing all the time. Even your sense of identity is changing over time. The ego, we think of that as the self. Well, the self is not a permanent thing. It's not even a reality. It's a fiction. And it's permanent in some ways. You have certain qualities that last, but it changes, and your sense of yourself changes. Everything that's less than the reality itself is always being modified. But the context of modification is not itself being modified. And that's what consciousness itself is. And that's what makes the teaching radical. It's at the root. And the root, the foundation, doesn't change, whereas everything else does.
What if, like on the ceiling of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, Adam and God reaching to each other and not touching, what if the eternal does exist, but it is, for some reason, unbridgeable?
Well, a lot of people feel that it is unbridgeable. And in a sense, you could say that. In mathematical terms, you could say, mathematical infinity. Well, you can't get there from here. That's the absurdity of mathematical infinity. Infinity belongs to the prior inherently. It doesn't really have anything to do with mathematics. But mathematicians want it to. And so they say that you take a number and you keep adding one, and it keeps going, and eventually the limit is infinity. Well, that's preposterous. Infinity is not a number, and it can never be a number. And you can't get there by adding one more unit to it.
Not even a hugely immense number,
yeah,
as you say.
But it's contradictory because, like we were about to say, all mathematicians know that infinity is not a number, but they pretend and they act as if it were. And if they're being technically exact, they'll say it's a limit. Well, there's not a limit. It has nothing to do with number. So it's not a limit on number. There is no limit on number because you can keep adding one more. Where do you stop? It doesn't matter how big the number is. You're just going to get to another number, and it has nothing to do with infinity. So that's my objection to Cantor's set theory. Set theory is trivial if it doesn't incorporate infinity. So Cantor had to bring infinity into it and talk about actual infinite sets. There's a contradiction in terms, and it's bullshit.
You won me over to in your view of mathematical infinity and your sensitivity to metaphor and the abuses of metaphor, which of course Julian Jaynes is also very sensitive to.
Yeah.
He says consciousness itself to him is and his narrow definition of consciousness, self-consciousness almost you could call it, is comprised of language, and language is inherently metaphorical. He says that even the verb to be can be broken down, and it means a growing plant is the metaphor behind the verb to be.
Right.
And people, all sorts of systems can get wildly awry when people mistake a metaphor for reality.
Yeah. Well, the thing about metaphor is that it's so fundamental, we don't suspect its depth of influence.
Because it's the only way we can think.
Yeah, you can say that all human understanding is inherently metaphorical. And that's true to the extent that you're thinking of understanding as something that can be expressed in language or something that can be expressed in some kind of finite way, Metaphor is a great gift. people that are good at metaphor are in a sense, geniuses. But when you're talking about the prior realm, you're not talking about a metaphor, and you're not talking about metaphorical understanding. You're talking about revelation. It comes all at once. It doesn't even have any meaning. Reality itself is meaningless.
Of course.
Because it is not even unified. It is a unity. The void is one. It's not something that's put together. It was never taken apart. It's the context. It's the whole thing. It has no distinction. So it has no meaning. To have meaning, you have to have two things that you can relate. But when you're at the level of the prior, it's even funny to talk about it as a level, but the prior realm has no distinctions. It's a void, and if it's a void of distinctions. Well, this makes no sense to the mind. That's why the first thing I say about it in the void is that the void is inherently paradoxical, because the mind cannot grasp it. So it is paradoxical, and that's the trouble we have with certainty and permanence. We assume that it's not available because we simply have no sense of the prior at all.
In the words of the folk songwriter Bill Callahan, who I would also call transcendentalist, have faith in wordless knowledge. And in that same song, well, I could tell you about the river, or we could just get in.
Yeah. Get in. Take it on a spiritual practice, for example, is getting in. And it took me a long time to do that. I'd been reading spiritual literature since the age of about 14, up until the age of 30, when I finally encountered my teacher. And during that time, I was what you would call an armchair spiritual seeker. And I was reading books about spirituality, but I wasn't engaging in a practice. I wasn't that serious about it. I was serious enough about it to be certainly interested in it and motivated to find out more. But I had done that for a long time. And by the time I was 30, I almost passed up reading the first couple of books that were published by my teacher, because I thought, I've been reading these books for 15 more years, and it hasn't really made a difference, so why buy another one? And I did pass it up for a little while, but eventually there was, 6 months later, there was another opportunity in which I had nothing else to read or to do. And a book of his had been recently published. It was available in his bookshop, and so I bought it and read it. I had nothing else to do. And that's when I realized that my teacher had arrived.
Thank you for sharing that. I think you used the term armchair spiritual seeker advisedly, because I have used the term armchair philosophy to describe the nature of this show.
I didn't mean to be overly insulting.
No, it's not insulting at all. I mean, I use it ironically in a way, because right. I would rather understand 60% of something and start applying it and figure it out through conversation than than die in a library somewhere. Yeah.
Well, I learned the same lesson about music. I was actually afraid of being a composer, and I felt like I couldn't do it. I mean, I hadn't. You can't learn composition in school, and I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to compose. But what I found out was, you learn it by doing it. You got to start doing it. It doesn't matter whether you think you're qualified. You're going to learn how to do it if you're passionate about it, and you start doing it. So I just started composing, and after a while, I found out, okay, well, I'm a composer now because I'm doing it, and I'm actually even liking some of the things that are happening. So it's the same thing, with a spiritual practice. You have to engage one before you know anything about it.
I think we should make this a finite episode. You are absolutely welcome to come back on the show anytime. And to do, if you ever want to maybe perhaps write and record your perspective on something, on an artist or on an issue of spirituality, I can incorporate it into future episodes of the show. I'd love to give you a voice. You are. This is a show about contemporary music, because everything is contemporary in a way of speaking. You know, I don't want it to start feeling academic. So by that nature, I'm mostly going to be talking to people in their 20s and 30s, and you have much more of a developed spiritual practice than most people. So your guidance is certainly helpful and welcome.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk, because I think it's important for me to share as much as I can while I can. And I would love to be involved in future shows if you have a good reason for that to happen, and I'd be more than happy to participate. So you can see what the response is, and if you think that people are interested in hearing more, then I'm more than ready to talk all afternoon.
Cool. Me too. I don't currently have that reason, but perhaps one will come to me or to you. Well, thank you so much, Ray, for coming on. I of course encourage people to check out Ray Lynch's music, and thank you for coming.
It was my pleasure. It was delightful. I enjoyed it. So I'll talk to you again.
All right.
Okay.